At my son's wedding dinner, my husband stood up, smiled, and said he'd found someone new. Everyone froze. The music stopped. Forks hung in the air, and all eyes turned to me. After 30 years of marriage, he ended our life together in front of our entire family. But what he didn't know was that I already knew his secret, and I'd been quietly planning something he'd never see coming. The night had started with joy, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. My son Julian sat beside his new bride, their hands joined tightly, faces glowing with happiness. I had spent months making sure everything went perfectly, from the flowers to the music. Watching him smile made every long day worth it. For once, I felt at peace. I believed the storms in my marriage could wait until tomorrow, but as I watched Charles fill his glass again, I saw a strange look in his eyes that I had learned not to ignore. Charles had been restless lately, his charm turning into something cold and distant. At family dinners, his phone became more important than conversation. He laughed at things I didn't understand, smiled at messages I couldn't see. I told myself it was work stress, but deep down, I already knew something was wrong. Still, I kept smiling for Julian's sake. Tonight was supposed to be about love, family, and fresh beginnings. I didn't know Charles had chosen this very night to burn everything to the ground. The ballroom shimmered with soft light. Waiters glided between tables carrying silver trays. Everyone looked beautiful, happy, content. I felt proud, sitting there in my blue dress, the same shade I'd worn at my own wedding decades ago. Charles had once said it was his favorite color. Now I saw him standing with that same calm expression, holding a wine glass, like it was part of a performance. Something inside me braced itself. I'd seen this look before, when he was about to deliver bad news while pretending everything was fine. He tapped the glass with a spoon, the sound echoing through the room. The crowd fell quiet, expecting a heartfelt toast from the proud father. Julian looked at his dad with admiration, unaware of what was coming. My chest felt heavy, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing too much. Charles smiled politely at everyone, pretending to gather his thoughts. Then, with the same tone he used to order coffee, he said he had found someone new. It was over, just like that. 30 years erased in front of 100 people. The room went still. Music stopped mid-note. Guests stared, their expressions frozen between confusion and pity. My son's bride gasped softly, her hand trembling on Julian's arm. I heard my own heartbeat like distant thunder. Charles looked so proud of himself, as if he'd done something brave. And then, across the table, I saw her. Tasha, his secretary. Her red dress caught the light, and the faintest smile curved her lips. The same woman who had helped me plan his last birthday party now sat watching me lose everything she thought was hers to gain. Everyone waited for me to break down. They wanted tears or shouting, something to complete the drama, but I felt nothing. The hurt had already happened months ago. Now I was prepared. My purse sat beside me, small and black, holding more power than anyone in that room could imagine. I reached for it slowly, not to hide, but to finish what I had started. My hands didn't shake. I had been waiting for this moment, and I wouldn't waste it. I looked at Charles, smiled, and knew I was finally in control. Inside the purse was a white envelope. It had taken months to prepare, carefully worded, legally sound and timed perfectly. I placed it beside his dinner plate like a small gift. He glanced at it, confused, but didn't open it. His confidence was unshaken for now. I stood, adjusted my dress, and looked at my son. He sat frozen, torn between disbelief and shame. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault. This was between me and his father. Nothing could ruin his special day, not even this. I straightened my shoulders and faced the room. Dozens of faces stared back, unsure what to do or say. My instincts told me to hide, but my pride kept me standing tall. I smiled politely and told everyone to enjoy their dinner. Then I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, the crowd began to whisper in waves. My heels clicked on the ballroom floor, each step closing the book on 30 years of sacrifice. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to save, only something new to begin. The hotel hallway was quiet compared to the chaos behind the doors. For the first time in months, I could breathe without pretending. I could almost hear the voice of my younger self asking why it took so long to choose peace. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, leaving the glitter and gossip behind me. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked calm, not broken. The envelope on that table would do the talking for me. I had already done enough crying in secret. Tonight I walked away with my dignity intact. The plan had begun 6 months earlier when I first noticed the missing money. Charles had always trusted me with our finances. I handled the bills, the mortgage, and the savings. But then, small withdrawals began appearing, 50 here, 200 there. I thought maybe he was helping a friend, until the pattern grew. My gut told me to look deeper. I printed every statement, highlighted every suspicious line, and started connecting the dots. The truth was right there, hidden under layers of lies, waiting for me to see it clearly. I had no idea that betrayal could be so organized. Charles had opened a secret account in another bank under his own name. It was filled with deposits from our joint savings. He was quietly moving our future away from me. Each time I looked at those numbers, my chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. I began tracking him like an investigator, learning where he went, who he met, and how much he spent. The more I discovered, the more my sadness turned into something sharper focus. The first time I saw Tasha's name on a receipt, I almost dropped it. A jewelry purchase, expensive and careless. He had claimed we couldn't afford new curtains, yet he could buy her diamond earrings. I didn't confront him. I smiled, cooked dinner, and acted like nothing was wrong. Anger would have given him warning, and I wanted surprise. I told myself that patience would hurt him more than rage ever could. Every fake smile became another brick in the wall I was quietly building between us. I began documenting everything. I took photos of his texts when he left his phone unattended. I kept copies of hotel bookings and travel receipts. I even noted his late returns home on the calendar, marking each with small dots that only I could understand. The truth was unfolding, piece by piece, like a puzzle no one else could see. At night, I stared at the ceiling, not crying anymore, just thinking. I had spent half my life protecting this man. Now, I was protecting myself from him. When I met with a lawyer from church, I expected sympathy, but what I got was strategy. She helped me review our marriage agreement, the one Charles had pushed for decades ago to protect his assets. Hidden inside it was a faithfulness clause. If one partner cheated, the other kept nearly everything. I left her office that day feeling lighter. For the first time in years, I had power. I decided to wait until the perfect moment to act. The wedding would be his stage, and his downfall would be public. For 6 months, I pretended everything was fine. I hosted dinners, paid bills, and even helped Tasha plan office events. Each time she smiled at me, I smiled back, already knowing what she didn't. My patience became my greatest weapon. Charles thought I was weak, predictable, and blind. That belief would cost him everything. I didn't know exactly how the final scene would play out, but I trusted that the day would come. And when it did, it would be beautiful, painful, and fair. Each morning, I packed Charles's lunch and watched him drive away in that silver car I once helped him buy. He used to kiss my cheek before leaving, but now he only waved. I'd stand at the window, pretending not to care, while memorizing the exact time he left. When I checked later, the mileage never matched his supposed destinations. The lies were piling up faster than the receipts. Yet, I kept acting like everything was normal. Pretending was easier than explaining heartbreak to people who already thought our marriage was perfect. I started saving every detail, every forgotten lie, every strange purchase. I created a folder labeled House Expenses and stored everything inside it, though nothing in that folder had anything to do with the house. Inside were records of deceit. I saw charges for hotels along the coast, restaurants miles away, and gifts that never appeared at home. It was as if he had built another life entirely. I stopped waiting for apologies. my silence became a weapon sharper than words. Every discovery fueled a calm determination to end things on my terms. When Charles said he needed more space for business travel, I quietly smiled. It gave me the time to meet my lawyer again. Together we mapped out each step. She helped me open a new account only in my name, transfer my inheritance funds, and secure what was rightfully mine. I wasn't taking revenge. I was taking back what I earned. I worked hard my whole life for stability, not to watch it disappear into someone else's fantasy. Every signature I made brought me closer to freedom, one quiet stroke of the pen at a time. At church, people still saw us as the ideal couple. They complimented our devotion and laughed at how long we'd been together. I smiled back, never correcting them. They didn't need to know that every Sunday morning I sat beside a man who had already left me in his mind. Pretending gave me peace. It allowed me to plan without suspicion. Tasha even joined our pew once, pretending to be friendly. Her perfume lingered longer than her faith, and her eyes avoided mine. I already knew everything she thought she was hiding. Charles's arrogance gave me all the information I needed. He wasn't careful because he never imagined I could outsmart him. He believed I was too soft, too dependent, too forgiving. I used that belief as cover. Behind every nod and smile, I was preparing the legal groundwork to secure the house, savings, and pension. The process was long, but I enjoyed watching him underestimate me. Before we continue, I want to thank everyone who's listening. Please like this video, subscribe if you haven't yet, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I began paying close attention to our home routine. When Charles showered, I checked his briefcase. I found travel itineraries that didn't match his work schedule. I memorized the names of hotels and even the room numbers. One night, I printed copies of his credit card statements and hid them inside an old cookbook. He never cooked, so I knew it was safe there. Every time he looked at me and lied, I felt stronger, not weaker. Knowing the truth gave me a strange calm that even he couldn't shake. 6 months before Julian's wedding, I noticed something strange. Charles was suddenly generous with family gifts again. He gave Julian an expensive watch and offered to pay for part of the wedding venue. I realized he was spending more to appear responsible before leaving me. He wanted to look like a loving father and husband, right up until the end. The hypocrisy almost made me laugh. If he thought appearances mattered more than honesty, I would let him keep that illusion. His downfall would come in the same place he sought admiration. At work, I started staying late at the bank. My coworkers thought I was chasing a promotion, but I was preparing for freedom. Using my knowledge, I created detailed records of every joint account. I even checked our mortgage agreements, insurance policies, and retirement plans. By the time I was done, there was nothing left that Charles could use to surprise me. I had become the expert of our financial life. I wasn't afraid anymore. I felt steady, calm, and certain. The future was mine to rebuild, piece by piece. One evening, I overheard him talking on the phone while he thought I was asleep. His tone was gentle, full of warmth I hadn't heard in years. He mentioned weekend plans and used her name. I stayed in bed, pretending to rest, while my mind sharpened with each word. It was confirmation. There was no doubt left. Instead of crying, I got up quietly the next morning, made breakfast, and continued my day. Grief had no use anymore. I was saving every ounce of my energy for something far more meaningful: closure. By the time wedding preparations began, my decision was final. I wasn't staying to fight or beg. I was staying to finish. I filed preliminary paperwork under my lawyer's guidance, making sure the timing aligned perfectly with the big day. My lawyer called it poetic justice. I called it balance. The same man who built a false life would lose it under the bright lights of a ballroom filled with witnesses. All I had to do was smile and wait. The date was set. His public betrayal would meet its quiet consequence. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a test of patience. Charles acted like the proud father, giving speeches about family and love. I stood beside him in photos, wearing a smile that no longer reached my eyes. Each time he kissed my cheek in front of guests, I wanted to laugh. He thought I was still trapped in his version of marriage. But I had already escaped. My freedom existed in paperwork he hadn't seen, and plans he would never understand until it was too late. His show was nearly over. Tasha tried to blend into family gatherings like she belonged. She volunteered to help with decorations, pretending to be thoughtful. She even asked me about floral arrangements, as if we were friends. I nodded politely, noting every interaction. She wanted to see if I suspected anything. I gave her nothing. I became the perfect picture of ignorance. Inside, I counted the days. The wedding would be her triumph, and her downfall too. She had no idea the stage she helped decorate was being built for her own embarrassment. My daughter-in-law, Sophia, noticed how quiet I'd become. She asked if I was feeling okay. I told her wedding planning was simply exhausting. It wasn't a lie. Emotional endurance was work too. Watching Charles pretend made me tired, but I wouldn't let anyone see the cracks. My focus was on Julian's happiness. Whatever happened between me and his father, my son would have his perfect day. That was my promise to myself. I would make sure his wedding stayed untouched by the storm waiting just beyond the edge of celebration. As the final days approached, I double-checked every legal document. I met my lawyer one last time to confirm that the filing would be submitted on the morning of the wedding. The timing had to be precise. The papers would process before Charles even lifted his wine glass that night. Once his announcement was made, his own words would seal his fate. I didn't need revenge. I needed closure backed by proof. By the time the first dance started, my independence would already be protected by law. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, thinking about all the years we had shared. The good ones, the hard ones, and the years in between when I felt invisible. I realized how much of myself I had given away for the sake of keeping peace. Tomorrow would end that version of me. Tomorrow I would become my own person again. I wasn't nervous or scared, only ready. The silence of that night felt like the deep breath before a new beginning. When the morning came, the house buzzed with excitement. Relatives called, hair appointments were made, and photographers arrived early. Charles acted cheerful, humming while he got dressed. I watched him tie his tie in the mirror, wondering how many lies hid behind that smile, but I didn't feel anger anymore. He wasn't my problem. My lawyer texted me a single word: filed. The papers were in motion. I tucked my phone into my purse and fixed my hair. The day belonged to my son, but the future belonged to me. At the church, I focused on the ceremony instead of the man beside me. Julian looked proud and strong, saying his vows with conviction. Tears filled my eyes, not from sadness, but from the joy of seeing my child step into a new life. When he turned to smile at me, I felt something lift inside me. For years, I had stayed in a loveless marriage for the children. Now, I knew they would be fine. They had grown, they had love, and soon, I would have peace. That was enough. After the ceremony, guests headed to the hotel ballroom for dinner. The decorations sparkled under soft lighting. Everything looked perfect, just as I had planned. Charles mingled easily, telling jokes, shaking hands, pretending to be the proud family man. Tasha lingered nearby, pretending to assist with seating. I caught her glance once and smiled back. She quickly looked away, her confidence fading. Somewhere inside her, she knew something wasn't quite right. The air around us held a quiet anticipation that only I understood. The night had finally arrived. Dinner began with laughter and toasts. The music played softly, and guests clapped after each speech. I kept my hands folded on the table, calm and still. Every time Charles lifted his glass, I saw the faint tremor of pride and nerves. He thought he was about to gain freedom. I knew he was about to lose everything. The moment felt strange, almost surreal. I had dreamed of this day, not for revenge, but for release. After years of silence, I would finally watch him expose himself without my saying a single word. Julian leaned over, telling me he was grateful for all I'd done. I smiled, hiding the ache in my chest. My son didn't deserve to see the truth tonight. He had built his new life with hope, and I wouldn't let his father's actions destroy that. I promised myself that no matter how painful the next few minutes became, I would keep calm. Let Charles speak. Let him humiliate himself. Let the world see what kind of man he truly was. I had already chosen grace over chaos, and it would stay that way. Charles tapped his glass, drawing attention to himself. The chatter faded instantly. Guests turned toward him, expecting a warm, fatherly speech. He stood tall, smiling as though delivering good news. My fingers pressed lightly against my purse, feeling the envelope inside. I kept my breathing even. Eyes focused but steady. I had pictured this scene hundreds of times. Now it was real. I watched his lips move as he began to speak, and I could almost sense the exact moment he crossed the line that ended everything we'd built. He thanked everyone for coming, complimented the food, and even praised me for the event's success. Then, with a casual shrug, he announced that our marriage was over and that he had found someone new. A quiet gasp rippled through the room, plates stopped clinking, and the band fell silent. For a brief second, he looked proud, as if making this statement was an act of bravery. I sat still, my expression calm. Inside, I felt nothing but quiet satisfaction. The trap had closed exactly as planned. Julian froze beside his bride, confusion written all over his face. Guests whispered, unsure how to react. Tasha sat across from me, pretending surprise but failing miserably. The corners of her mouth twitched, betraying her nervous thrill. She believed she had won something tonight. I simply reached for my purse, careful and deliberate, and pulled out the envelope. My hands didn't tremble. I had rehearsed this moment in my head so many times it felt natural. I placed it neatly beside his plate, right where everyone could see. Charles looked down at the envelope, puzzled. His confident smile faltered for the first time. He didn't open it, too distracted by the attention he'd created. I stood up, smoothing my dress. The crowd watched, waiting for me to cry, to collapse, to scream. But I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. I turned to my son, told him to enjoy his night, and walked away. I left behind 30 years of silence, 30 years of giving more than I received. My only luggage that night was freedom disguised as dignity. The ballroom doors closed behind me, and I heard whispers turn into a storm. People would talk for weeks, maybe months, about what happened. Let them. I didn't care. The envelope on that table held everything: proof of betrayal, evidence of theft, and signed papers that would soon strip him of the life he thought he controlled. As I stepped into the quiet hallway, I felt something lift off my shoulders. I had waited half a lifetime for this peace, and now it was finally mine to claim. Outside the ballroom, I paused in the hallway, hearing the faint buzz of voices behind the doors. The air smelled of perfume and champagne, but it no longer felt like celebration. I walked toward the elevators, keeping my head high. Somewhere inside that room, Charles was beginning to realize that his victory speech would cost him more than pride. The papers in that envelope would turn his arrogance into regret. I didn't need to witness the fallout. My part was done. Now it was his turn to deal with consequences he brought on himself. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, watching the floor numbers descend slowly. The quiet hum of movement felt like a cleansing rhythm. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked older, but stronger. I thought about the years I wasted protecting someone who would never have done the same for me. Yet, I didn't feel bitter. I felt relieved. My phone buzzed, texts from guests, from relatives, and from my son. I ignored them all. I couldn't comfort anyone yet. Tonight wasn't about answers. Tonight was about reclaiming peace after decades of pretending. Outside, the hotel lights glowed against the night sky. I stepped into a taxi waiting near the entrance, my heels clicking softly against the pavement. As we drove away, I didn't look back once. The city blurred past the window, and my mind began to settle. I thought of the house Charles believed he would take with him. He didn't know that the title was already under my name. Every corner of that home carried my sacrifices, my earnings, and my memories. It would never belong to anyone else again. Not anymore. When I reached the house, the silence greeted me like an old friend. I switched on the hallway light, and walked through rooms filled with traces of the life we built together. The family photos, the furniture, the smell of old wood polish. It was all still here, frozen in time. Yet, something felt different now. I no longer saw reminders of him. I saw survival. Every object in this home carried proof of how much I had endured. And now every corner would become a symbol of how much I had overcome. In the bedroom, I opened his closet and found his suitcases neatly packed behind his coats. He had been ready to leave early, the next morning. The sight made me laugh quietly. Even in betrayal, he was predictable. He probably imagined leaving me with tears while he drove off with Tasha to start fresh. Instead, he would return to find nothing left but paperwork and the ruins of his pride. I closed the closet door gently. I wanted him to see it exactly as he left it, untouched, but no longer his. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the living room, the same place where we used to watch movies as a family. I opened my laptop and reviewed the confirmation emails from my lawyer. Everything was in motion. The filings, the account freezes, the transfer of ownership. The pieces of my plan fit together perfectly. I no longer had to chase justice. It was already mine. The sound of the clock ticking filled the room. I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for him to come home. My phone buzzed again with messages. There were dozens now. Some from guests, some from relatives, all asking what had happened. One stood out. It was from my son Julian. He wanted to make sure I was safe. I typed back a short message, telling him I was fine and that he shouldn't worry. He deserved to enjoy his wedding night, without being burdened by his father's selfishness. I knew he would be angry later when he learned the truth, but I trusted that, in time, he would understand why I stayed silent. As midnight approached, headlights flashed through the window. I recognized the sound of his car engine before I even looked. It roared into the driveway, brakes screeching like an argument waiting to happen. I stayed seated, calm, letting him come to me. The front door burst open, and footsteps thundered across the floor. I heard him call my name, his voice full of fury and disbelief. He had opened the envelope by now. Every lie he had told was laid out in front of him, and the reality of what he had lost was finally setting in. He stormed into the living room, still in his wedding suit, his face red and wild. He held the envelope in one hand, the papers crumpled and torn. He shouted questions, demanding explanations, but I stayed quiet. I simply looked at him, letting his anger burn itself out. He was realizing too late that I was no longer the woman who absorbed his chaos. He wanted control, but control was gone. He had handed it to me when he broke his vows. All I had left to give him now was silence and consequence. I stood up, meeting his eyes without fear. He had been the confident one for so long, but now he was unraveling in front of me. The documents I had filed that morning made everything official. He couldn't undo them with charm or excuses. The look on his face told me he finally understood that. His voice softened, his words shifting from anger to pleading. But it didn't matter. I had already made peace with the end. I didn't need him to apologize. I needed him to face what he had built for himself. He followed me around the room, trying to explain, but his excuses sounded hollow. The man who once demanded loyalty now begged for leniency. He said we could fix things, that our history meant something. I kept walking, not out of cruelty, but out of truth. There was nothing left to save. The trust that once built our home had long turned to dust. I realized then that I had been alone for years, pretending not to be. It wasn't heartbreak anymore. It was clarity, and it was the most freeing feeling of my life. I went to the hallway table and picked up my small travel bag. It had been packed for days, ready for this exact moment. Inside were clothes, documents, and keys to my brother Tom's house. I had told him only part of the story, but he knew enough to open his door for me. Charles kept talking behind me, his voice rising again, desperate to be heard. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been written in those papers. I simply walked toward the door without looking back. He shouted about our years together, about everything we'd shared. I paused for a brief second, hand on the doorknob, thinking about how love could become so blind. We had built a life out of small sacrifices, mostly mine, and now he stood shocked that it could end so neatly. I didn't feel guilt. I felt justice. I turned the lock, stepped outside, and closed the door behind me. The air outside was cool and quiet. His voice was muffled now, trapped inside the house he no longer owned. I walked to my car calmly. Driving away, I saw the glow of our home in the rearview mirror. The house looked peaceful, almost like it had been waiting for this silence. I didn't cry. I just gripped the wheel firmly and kept driving. The roads were empty, the night sky clear. I thought about what tomorrow would bring. The gossip, the judgment, the sympathy. None of it mattered. People would talk, but they wouldn't know the truth. They would never understand that I hadn't lost a husband tonight. I had simply removed the weight that kept me from living freely. Tom's house sat across town, near the college where he taught. The porch light was on when I arrived. He opened the door before I even knocked, his face full of concern. He didn't ask questions right away. He just guided me inside and poured coffee. The warmth of that moment reminded me that family still existed, even after betrayal. I sat down, feeling the exhaustion finally catch up to me. Tom didn't press for details. He knew when someone needed space. For the first time that night, I let myself exhale deeply. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and warm. I hadn't slept much, but I felt steady. Tom made breakfast while I checked my phone. There were missed calls from Julian, my daughter Sophia, and even Charles. I ignored them all. The world could wait. I needed to think clearly. Tom finally asked what had really happened. I told him the truth. From the missing money, to the affair, to the announcement at the wedding. His jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He listened the way a brother should, with quiet anger and loyalty. When I finished, Tom leaned back and shook his head. He said Charles had always been selfish, but never imagined he would do something this cruel. I wasn't surprised. I had lived with his selfishness for years. I told Tom that everything was already in motion, legally and financially. He seemed proud of me, though his eyes carried sadness. I think he mourned the years I lost, more than I did. I didn't want pity. I wanted understanding, and sitting there in my brother's kitchen, I finally felt understood for the first time in years. I spent most of that day in silence, watching the clock and waiting for news. My lawyer texted again to confirm that all joint accounts were officially frozen. Charles couldn't access a single shared dollar. The house, the investments, the savings, all locked until the court hearing. He still had his personal account, but that was all. He had turned a stable life into a disaster in one evening. I imagined him pacing, calling his lawyer, realizing that his perfect plan had collapsed. For once, I didn't have to do anything. Justice was already unfolding. Late that afternoon, Tom's phone rang. He looked at the screen and frowned before answering. It was Julian. His voice carried through the speaker, tense and worried. He said his father was telling people that I had gone crazy, that I'd been planning to ruin him for months. I almost laughed. It was exactly what I expected. When people like Charles lose control, they rewrite the story to look like victims. I told Tom not to worry. Truth doesn't need defending. It just waits patiently for lies to crumble under their own weight. Julian arrived at Tom's house that evening, still wearing part of his wedding outfit. He looked exhausted and heartbroken. When he saw me, he didn't speak. He just hugged me tightly, holding on like he was trying to understand everything at once. I told him the truth. Not every ugly detail, but enough. I explained that I hadn't wanted to ruin his big day. I had planned everything so that he could have the wedding he deserved. He didn't say much, but I could see the anger forming, not at me, but at the man who caused it all. Julian sat down at the table with us, staring at his hands. He asked why I hadn't told him earlier. I explained that timing mattered, that sometimes silence protects more than it hides. He nodded slowly, still processing it all. I told him not to let this destroy his new marriage or his happiness. His father's mistakes didn't belong to him. He needed to move forward without carrying that burden. I saw tears in his eyes, but he tried to smile. That small attempt told me he would be okay eventually. Later that night, as we sat together, my phone buzzed again. It was my lawyer. The court had accepted the emergency filing that froze everything. My plan was now airtight. I showed Tom and Julian the message. Tom raised his coffee mug like a quiet toast, while Julian managed a small smile. I felt warmth spread through me, not from revenge, but from relief. The kind of peace that comes when the storm finally stops. I realized I didn't need anything else from Charles. The law would handle what my patience already prepared. Tom turned on the television, but none of us really watched. The air felt lighter. Julian leaned back, asking softly what I would do next. I said I didn't know yet, but I wanted to focus on myself for once. Maybe start that bakery I'd always dreamed about. His face lit up at the thought, and he encouraged me instantly. That small spark of excitement was all I needed. For decades I lived for others. Now I would live for myself. It wasn't the ending I wanted, but it was the one I earned. Before going to bed, I checked my messages one last time. Charles had sent a dozen of them, some angry, some begging. I didn't respond. There was no satisfaction in replying, only noise I no longer needed. I blocked his number and turned off my phone. The quiet that followed felt strange but peaceful. I crawled into bed and let my body rest. I knew tomorrow would bring new challenges, court dates, gossip, maybe confrontation. But for tonight, I allowed myself to simply rest in victory. I had survived something many never recover from. Morning arrived calm and bright. Birds chirped outside the window, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. I poured myself coffee and looked out at Tom's backyard. It had been years since I'd woken up without tension in my chest. My lawyer texted again, saying the court hearing was scheduled for next week. I smiled. The path ahead would be long, but the hardest part was over. I had faced betrayal, humiliation, and deceit, and walked away with dignity intact. Whatever came next would be mine alone to shape. The following afternoon, I decided to return to the house to collect a few personal things. I drove slowly, expecting quiet, but the moment I pulled into the driveway, I saw his car already parked there. For a second I considered leaving, but then I remembered that I had nothing to fear anymore. This was still my home. I stepped out calmly, keys in hand, and walked toward the door. The air felt heavy, not from tension, but from the weight of history closing in on itself. It was time to face what remained. When I entered, Charles was sitting on the couch, surrounded by papers. He looked tired and defeated, a version of himself I barely recognized. I didn't say anything. I walked past him to the stairs and began collecting what I came for. He followed, talking endlessly about mistakes and forgiveness, but the words no longer mattered. I moved through each room with quiet purpose, separating what belonged to me from what didn't. Every folded shirt, every framed photo, felt like removing a piece of someone I no longer knew or needed. He finally stopped talking when he realized I wasn't listening. The silence between us was louder than any argument. I picked up an old wedding photo and stared at it for a moment. We both looked so young, hopeful, unaware of what time and pride could do to two people. I placed the picture frame face down on the dresser. I didn't want to throw it away, but I couldn't bear to look at it either. Some memories aren't meant to be destroyed, just quietly put to rest. That was all this was now. He began pacing again, talking about how unfair everything was. He said I had turned our family against him, that I was being cruel. I didn't respond. I simply zipped my suitcase and closed the bedroom door behind me. I had spent years explaining myself to a man who never truly listened. I wouldn't waste another word. When I reached the living room, I placed the house keys on the table, even though I didn't need to. It was my house now, but I wanted him to understand something. Ownership meant nothing without peace. He finally sat down again, exhausted from his own excuses. I watched him quietly, Not with anger, but with a kind of sadness that comes when you finally stop loving someone who stopped deserving it. I wished things had been different once long ago, but that wish had no power anymore. I told him he had until tomorrow to take his belongings and leave. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply stated the truth. He nodded slowly, not out of agreement, but because he had no strength left to fight. When I returned to Tom's house that evening, the atmosphere felt lighter. Julian was there, helping Tom fix something in the yard. Seeing them together warmed me. It reminded me that even after betrayal, love still existed in other forms. We had dinner as a family, simple food that tasted better than any fancy meal from the past. Laughter even slipped through the conversation, cautious but real. It felt like the start of healing, the kind that comes from being around people who genuinely care about you without expecting anything in return. After dinner, we sat in the living room, and I told them I had gone back home to gather my things. Tom looked uneasy, but I assured him everything was fine. I told them Charles looked lost, smaller somehow. Julian stayed quiet, staring at the floor. I could tell he was struggling between anger and pity for his father. I understood. Betrayal cuts deeper when it comes from family. I told him that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from the hold of pain. He nodded, but his expression stayed heavy. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts wandered through decades of memories. Our first apartment, the nights we couldn't afford much, but laughed anyway, the promises we made. They were all real once. That truth mattered more than the lies that came later. I had spent so much time mourning what I lost that I forgot to appreciate what I had gained: independence, strength, and the quiet certainty that I would never accept less again. As I drifted off, I finally felt the kind of calm that comes after long storms. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Tom opened the door and called out for me to come to the living room. When I walked in, I froze for a moment. Charles stood there, and beside him was Tasha. Her confidence from before was gone, replaced by nervousness. Charles looked desperate, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. I stood by the doorway, steady and silent. It was clear they hadn't come to make peace. They had come to fight for something they had already lost. I stayed quiet, letting them speak first, because silence often says more than words. Charles began talking fast, blaming me for freezing the accounts. He said I was destroying his future and embarrassing him. I didn't interrupt. I let him unravel on his own. His voice cracked when he mentioned how much he'd lost overnight. I wanted to tell him that everything he lost, he had chosen to risk, but I didn't. Beside him, Tasha looked uneasy, glancing from him to me, as if realizing she had walked into something far more complicated than she understood. The woman who once smirked now looked like someone who wanted to disappear. Tom crossed his arms, standing between them and me. He told them to calm down, but Charles ignored him. He kept talking about how unfair the law was, how much he deserved, how I had tricked him. I watched his anger twist into something close to panic. It was strange seeing him like that, so fragile, so lost. The man who once acted invincible now couldn't even hold himself together. Tasha finally spoke, asking him quietly about the separate account I had mentioned. Her voice trembled slightly. The truth was finally turning on him. Charles froze at her question. His eyes darted toward me, then back to her. He tried to dismiss it, but his hesitation told her everything. Tasha stepped back, her face tightening as she realized he had lied to her too. The tension between them filled the room, heavy and sharp. I didn't need to say a word. Watching the truth unfold between them was enough. For once, he wasn't just losing me, he was losing the illusion he had built around himself. The world he created was collapsing one secret at a time. Tasha's face turned pale as she realized she had been used. She asked how long he had planned to leave me, and when I mentioned that I had evidence dating back over a year, her expression changed completely. She looked at him like a stranger. It hit her that she had been part of a story that wasn't hers to begin with. Her pride was gone now, replaced by humiliation. She picked up her purse, muttered something under her breath, and walked toward the door. The sound of it closing behind her felt like closure. Charles stood there, silent for once. His anger had burned out, leaving only defeat. Tom motioned for him to leave, but he didn't move. He looked around the room as if searching for something familiar, something that could still make sense. There was nothing left. He mumbled something about how people would judge him unfairly. I didn't respond. Judgment wasn't my concern anymore. Truth had already spoken louder than gossip ever could. He finally turned and left without looking back. The moment he walked out, it felt like the air cleared around us. After he left, the room stayed quiet. Tom looked at me with relief, but I could see sadness in his eyes too. He hated confrontation, yet he stood firm when I needed him to. Julian sat beside me, still processing what had just happened. He said it was hard to see his father like that, broken and angry. I understood. It wasn't easy for me either, but sometimes strength isn't about winning. It's about standing still while everything false falls away. We didn't celebrate. We just sat quietly, letting peace settle in naturally. Later that evening, I took a walk through Tom's neighborhood. The streets were calm, lined with old oak trees and houses glowing softly from their porch lights. For the first time in years, I didn't feel watched or judged. I felt anonymous, free to exist without the weight of a title, no longer a wife, just a person. The wind carried the faint smell of jasmine from someone's garden. It reminded me that beauty could still exist after destruction. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to live again, one quiet step at a time. When I returned, Julian was sitting outside on the porch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up and smiled weakly. He said his friends were texting him about the scene at the wedding. I told him people always find entertainment in other people's pain. He nodded, then asked how I managed to stay so calm through it all. I told him calm doesn't come from control, it comes from clarity. Once you stop expecting honesty from the dishonest, peace stops feeling impossible. He sat quietly after that, maybe understanding more than he could express. We talked for hours that night, sharing memories that had nothing to do with pain. He told me about his plans with Sophia, their dreams for the future, and how he wanted to be the kind of husband his father never was. That made me smile. I told him that healing starts with not repeating what hurt you. He promised he'd remember that. The moonlight glowed softly on his face as he leaned back, tired but calm. I realized that even though this chapter of my life was ending, another one had just begun. The next morning, Tom left early for work, and Julian headed home to his wife. I stayed behind, enjoying the quiet. I made breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, and listened to soft music. It felt strange, how normal life could be after chaos. I opened my laptop to check emails and saw a message from my lawyer. The court hearing was confirmed for the next week. I stared at the screen for a long time, thinking about how far I'd come. Everything I once feared was now behind me, replaced by strength I never knew I had. Later that afternoon, Tom called to tell me that someone had seen Charles in town looking miserable. Apparently, word had spread fast about what happened. People who once admired him were now whispering behind his back. I didn't enjoy hearing it, but I didn't feel sorry either. Actions have consequences. I didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself. I told Tom not to worry about the rumors. Let people talk. I was done defending my silence. From now on, the only story that mattered was the one I would write for myself. The days passed quickly as I began sorting through the next steps with my lawyer. She explained what to expect in court and assured me that everything looked strong in my favor. Her calm tone reminded me that this wasn't revenge, it was resolution. I finally had proof that preparation always beats pride. At night, I slept better, free of the dread that used to wake me before dawn. It was a strange feeling to know that peace didn't need noise. It just needed distance from the things that once stole it away. One evening, as I walked by the bakery downtown, I stopped to look inside. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, and customers laughed at small tables. I used to dream of owning a place like that. For years, Charles had told me it wasn't practical, that we couldn't afford it. I smiled, realizing that his voice no longer had power over my dreams. Maybe I would finally do it. Not for profit, not to prove anything, just because I wanted to. Sometimes the best revenge is living the life someone told you wasn't possible. Julian visited again that weekend, bringing me a small notebook. He said it was for ideas, for the bakery I'd been talking about. I laughed, saying I hadn't made any plans yet, but he insisted. I opened it and saw a note he had written on the first page. For new beginnings. It nearly brought tears to my eyes. I hugged him tightly, realizing that the love I had poured into my children had returned to me in the purest way possible. The kind of love no betrayal could ever take away. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the blank pages of the notebook. Each page felt like a promise waiting to be written. I listed names for the bakery, colors for the walls, ideas for cakes. For once, I didn't doubt myself. The world felt open again. I didn't know exactly how I'd start, but I knew I would. Healing isn't about forgetting, it's about creating something new in the empty space left behind. My life wasn't over. It was simply under construction, built stronger than before. The night grew quiet again, as I turned off the lights and looked out the window. The sky was clear, the air still. I thought about everything that had led me here. The heartbreak, the humiliation, the courage it took to stand tall. I realized I didn't need closure from Charles anymore. Life had already given me that in the form of peace. Whatever happened next, I would face it with calm and confidence. Tomorrow would bring the hearing. But tonight, I allowed myself to rest in gratitude. I had already won. The morning of the court hearing came sooner than I expected. I dressed simply, wearing a gray suit that made me feel composed and grounded. Tom offered to drive me, but I preferred to go alone. The courthouse wasn't far, and I wanted the quiet before it all began. When I arrived, the building looked cold and distant, but I felt strangely calm. I had nothing to hide. I wasn't fighting for revenge or attention. I was simply defending the truth, and that truth was already standing firmly on my side. Inside the courtroom, I saw Charles sitting with a new lawyer, younger and nervous-looking. He avoided my eyes. The man who once carried himself with pride now seemed smaller, defeated by his own mistakes. My lawyer greeted me with a reassuring nod. We sat down, waiting for the judge to begin. The room felt heavy, filled with quiet whispers and shuffling papers. I folded my hands and looked ahead. This was the moment everything would settle. Whatever the outcome, I already had peace. The rest was just formality now. The judge entered, a woman with a sharp gaze that demanded honesty. She opened the file in front of her and began reading. Her voice was firm but calm as she went through the marriage agreement. When she reached the faithfulness clause, she paused, adjusting her glasses. The courtroom grew completely silent. She read it aloud, confirming that the agreement remained valid through the entire duration of the marriage. Charles's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. I watched his confidence crumble, each word cutting away another piece of the illusion he had built. The judge then reviewed the financial statements and the evidence of money transfers. My lawyer handed her the documents I'd collected, neatly organized and time-stamped. The judge studied them carefully, occasionally glancing at Charles. His hands fidgeted on the table, tapping nervously. When she finished, she looked up and said the evidence was clear. There had been deception, and it violated the honesty clause of the agreement. Charles's lawyer tried to argue, but the judge raised her hand, signaling for silence. The decision was already forming in her mind, and I could see it plainly. When the ruling came, it was direct and fair. The joint accounts would remain frozen until full review, the house would stay under my possession, and I would retain the majority of our shared assets as outlined in the agreement. Charles was allowed access only to his personal account. The judge reminded him that contracts built on fairness must also be ended with fairness. His face turned red with anger, but he said nothing. He knew any word would only make it worse. The courtroom felt still, almost peaceful, as the session came to an end. As I walked out of the courtroom, Charles followed me into the hallway. His steps echoed behind mine. He called my name once, his voice softer than before. I stopped and turned, but I didn't speak. He asked if we could talk privately, said that 30 years together had to mean something. I looked at him and thought about all those years. The sacrifices, the loneliness, the constant effort to make things work. Then I realized something simple and painful. The years meant everything to me, but nothing to him. I just walked away quietly. Outside the courthouse, the wind was cool and light. I took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. For the first time, there was no guilt attached to leaving. I had done everything right, even when he hadn't. My lawyer joined me briefly, shaking my hand and saying congratulations. I thanked her and promised to keep moving forward. She smiled, saying most people don't walk into court that calm. I told her, peace is easier to find when you stop fighting what's already over. She nodded, understanding perfectly. Over the next few days, word spread quickly. In a small town, stories travel fast. Some people called to check on me, while others just wanted the details. I gave none. I wasn't going to feed gossip. I simply told them the truth, that Charles and I were divorced, and that life was continuing. People eventually stopped asking. Meanwhile, Charles became quieter around town. He stopped attending social events, and his business began struggling without the savings he'd hidden. He had built his future on dishonesty, and it was finally collapsing around him. Tasha disappeared from his life entirely. I later heard she moved out of the apartment they had planned to share. The same apartment he had promised her turned out not to exist in his name at all. The lease had been rejected weeks before because of his damaged credit. Everything he thought he controlled had slipped away. I didn't feel proud of his downfall, only relieved that I no longer had to carry the weight of it. Watching his lies unravel from a distance was more closure than any apology could give. One morning, I received a call from Tom. He had run into Charles by chance at a coffee shop. He said Charles looked thinner, drained, and completely different. He didn't seem angry anymore, just tired. Tom said he tried to be polite, but the conversation was awkward. I thanked him for telling me and asked him not to feel sorry for him. Charles was living the life he created. We all face the consequences of our choices. That was something I had learned too, but I faced mine with grace, not deceit. With each passing day, my focus shifted away from him entirely. I began searching for a small commercial space downtown. I wanted to open the bakery I had dreamed of for years. I met with a realtor, signed some preliminary forms, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: excitement. The smell of sugar and bread had always been my comfort. I imagined warm ovens, cheerful customers, and quiet mornings spent doing something that made me happy. It wasn't about money. It was about building something honest, something that finally belonged to me. Julian visited often, helping me plan the details. He said he wanted to design the bakery's logo and website. His energy brought joy back into my days. We would sit together for hours, talking about recipes, layouts, and colors. Each idea reminded me of how much potential still existed in life after heartbreak. He told me he admired how strong I'd been. I told him strength doesn't come naturally. It's built through pain and patience. He smiled, saying he'd remember that. It was good to see him healing too, rebuilding his own view of love. When the lease was finalized, I walked into the empty shop for the first time. The smell of dust and old paint filled the air, but to me it smelled like a new beginning. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, landing on the worn wooden floor. I stood in the middle of that quiet space and imagined the shelves filled with cakes and bread. It felt right. For years, I had built dreams around other people's needs. Now I was finally building one for myself. I named it in my mind: New Dawn Bakery. Setting up the bakery took time, but every step felt rewarding. I painted the walls a soft yellow, hung pictures of family, and bought secondhand furniture to give it warmth. Tom helped with repairs, while Julian handled the online pages. People walking by would peek through the windows, curious about what was coming. I liked that feeling of mystery. It reminded me of how far I'd come, from hidden pain to open purpose. I no longer lived in someone else's shadow. Each morning smelled of fresh hope and coffee, not deceit and pretense. On opening day, I expected only a few customers, but by noon, the shop was full. Neighbors came by, old friends stopped to say hello, and strangers lined up to try my cakes. I stood behind the counter, serving them with a smile that came from somewhere deep. When one woman said the pastries tasted like home, I almost cried. It was the kind of happiness I hadn't felt in years. Quiet, real, and earned. I didn't need grand victories or revenge. This small shop was proof that I had survived and rebuilt. That evening, after closing, I sat by the front window with a cup of tea. The lights from the street glowed softly through the glass. I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the court, the freedom that followed. I didn't regret any of it. Pain had shaped me into someone stronger, wiser, and more peaceful. I realized that love, when given to the wrong person, becomes a burden, but when turned inward, it becomes power. I had finally learned how to love myself without apology. That was the real victory, all along. As weeks passed, business continued to grow. Word spread about the bakery, and soon people came from nearby towns to try my recipes. I began offering custom cakes for weddings and birthdays. Each order carried a quiet sense of irony, celebrating love while having survived its ugliest side. But I didn't feel bitter. Every cake, every smile from a customer, reminded me that life still had sweetness to offer. Sometimes I caught myself thinking about Charles, but only for a second. The thought faded quickly, replaced by gratitude for how it all ended. Julian called one afternoon with surprising news. He said Charles had sold his business and moved into a small apartment near the city's edge. Apparently, he was trying to start over, but struggling. I didn't feel joy hearing that, only closure. Some people never learn until everything is gone. I told Julian to be kind if his father ever reached out. He didn't have to forgive, but he didn't need to carry anger either. Letting go is harder than revenge, but it's the only way peace lasts. He understood. That made me proud. A few days later, I saw Charles by coincidence. I was locking up the bakery when a car slowed near the curb. It was him. He looked older, worn out, his shoulders slouched. He stared at the bakery sign for a moment but didn't get out. Our eyes met briefly through the window. I didn't feel anger or pity, just distance. He nodded slightly, then drove away. I watched the car disappear down the street, realizing how different we had become. I had found peace in creation. He had found silence in regret. That night, I told Tom about seeing Charles. He said it was bound to happen sooner or later in a small town. I agreed, but didn't dwell on it. The past no longer had the power to ruin my days. Instead, I focused on small joys, trying new recipes, greeting customers, spending evenings with family. My world had become simple again, and I liked it that way. I had traded noise for calm, control for contentment. For once, I was living a life that didn't depend on anyone's approval but my own. A few months later, the bakery had become a local favorite. Children came after school, and elderly couples spent mornings sharing coffee. Each face that walked through the door reminded me that kindness still existed, that trust could still be found in small things. One afternoon, a customer asked if I ever baked for special causes. That question sparked a new idea. I started donating leftover bread and pastries to shelters each evening. Giving back filled the final empty space in me. It felt like turning pain into purpose, and it healed me even more. Julian and Sophia visited again with wonderful news. They were expecting a baby. Hearing that brought tears to my eyes. I hugged them both tightly, feeling years of struggle melt into joy. I promised to help however I could, and joked that the bakery would soon have its youngest regular customer. It felt poetic. New life arriving just as mine had found renewal. The cycle of family, love, and growth was beginning again, this time built on honesty and care. It reminded me that endings often hide beautiful beginnings inside them. That night, as I closed the bakery, I stood outside and looked up at the sign glowing softly above the door. New Dawn Bakery. The name felt more fitting than ever. It wasn't just a shop, it was a reminder that life doesn't end when someone betrays you, it restarts. The world keeps spinning, and the sun keeps rising, no matter how dark the night once felt. I whispered a quiet thank you to the universe for giving me the strength to survive what I thought would break me. I was whole again. In the months that followed, the bakery continued to thrive. Local newspapers wrote kind articles, praising not just the food but the story behind it. People found inspiration in knowing that someone could lose everything and still rebuild from scratch. I never sought attention, but it found me anyway. Each person who walked in had their own story of pain or change. I listened, smiled, and served them something warm. The bakery became more than a business. It became a place for others to remember that healing was always possible. One evening, as the day ended and the last customer left, I turned off the lights and sat quietly near the counter. The room smelled of sugar and coffee, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about the journey. From humiliation at a wedding dinner to peace in this little shop. Life had tested me in ways I never expected, but it had also rewarded me for standing tall. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad either. I was free, finally, and that was worth everything. The following spring arrived with soft rain and fresh air. Flowers bloomed outside the bakery windows, and life moved at a peaceful rhythm. I had built something real, something that couldn't be taken away. Each morning I unlocked the doors before sunrise, turning on the lights that made the shop glow warm and welcoming. Sometimes I thought about how much I had changed. The woman who once lived in fear of being left was gone. In her place stood someone who finally understood that independence was the truest form of love. Julian often stopped by on his way to work, grabbing a pastry and coffee before heading out. Seeing him every morning was a reminder that my choices had been right. He was happy, focused, and proud. I could see it in the way he carried himself. Every so often we'd talk about the past, but only briefly. He said he learned more from watching how I handled pain than from any advice I ever gave him. I smiled at that. Sometimes the best lessons come not from words, but from how you survive. One afternoon, as I was closing the bakery, a delivery driver brought an envelope with my name written in neat handwriting. I opened it and saw a short note from Charles. It wasn't long or emotional, just a simple acknowledgement of what he had done. He said he was sorry and wished me well. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness doesn't always require reconciliation. Sometimes it's enough to let someone know they no longer have the power to hurt you. That was all I needed. That evening, I walked to the small park near the bakery. The air smelled of rain, and the benches were wet with dew. Children played in the distance, their laughter floating through the air. I sat there for a while, watching them, thinking about how different my life had become. For years, I lived in survival mode, waiting for kindness from someone who had none to give. Now, I was surrounded by it every day, in customers, in family, in small moments that asked for nothing in return but gratitude. That was enough. A few days later, Tom stopped by the bakery during his lunch break. He said he had seen Charles around town again, this time helping out at a local workshop. Apparently, he was living a quiet life now. I didn't feel anything about it. No satisfaction, no anger, just neutrality. People change, or they don't. Either way, it was no longer my story to carry. I told Tom that I hoped he found peace too. He nodded, smiling softly, saying I already had enough for both of us. I realized he was right. When summer came, business grew even more. Tourists started visiting, and the bakery became a small landmark in town. People would take pictures, post kind reviews, and call it a place that felt like home. I didn't advertise the story behind it anymore. I didn't need to. The energy of the place told it all. It wasn't about loss or betrayal anymore. It was about resilience. The smell of vanilla and bread replaced memories of heartbreak. I had turned what was once pain into something warm, tangible, and sweet enough to heal others too. On quiet afternoons, I liked sitting near the back window, watching sunlight filter through the trees. I often thought about how easily people underestimate the strength of stillness. The world rushes to fix, to react, to argue, but sometimes power lies in simply staying calm and letting truth unfold naturally. That's what saved me. I didn't fight fire with fire, I let it burn itself out. Now I lived surrounded by calm, by proof that patience always wins in the end. That realization became the anchor for everything that came after. Julian's baby was born that autumn, a beautiful little girl with big eyes and a calm presence. When I held her for the first time, everything inside me softened. I saw a future that had nothing to do with pain or revenge, only love and legacy. I promised myself she would grow up knowing that strength doesn't always mean shouting or fighting. Sometimes it means walking away with your dignity intact. She gripped my finger tightly, and I smiled. Life had taken so much, but in its own way it had given more back. Sophia visited the bakery often with the baby. She said the smell of cinnamon always reminded her of home. I loved watching her rock the baby to sleep while the ovens hummed softly in the background. It made me think of my own early years as a mother, busy, uncertain, and full of dreams I'd tucked away. Now those dreams were alive again, not just in me, but in them too. The next generation didn't need to repeat the same mistakes. They would build love on truth, not illusion. That thought comforted me deeply. Every so often, I'd get letters from old friends who had heard about what happened. Some shared their own stories of betrayal, others just wrote to say they admired my strength. I read every word, grateful but humbled. I wasn't special. I had simply chosen not to stay broken. Life gives everyone a choice at some point, to be destroyed by pain or to rebuild stronger. I had chosen the latter, not because I was fearless, but because I refused to let fear decide for me anymore. That choice changed everything. One crisp evening, I closed the bakery early and took a walk through town. The sky glowed orange as the sun began to set. The streets were quiet, and I could hear distant laughter from a nearby cafe. I walked past the hotel where everything had fallen apart years ago. It looked exactly the same. Bright lights, polished floors, people laughing inside. But it no longer had power over me. It was just another building now, another night long gone. I smiled, realizing I had finally made peace with my past completely. Sometimes, healing sneaks up on you in small ways. It doesn't announce itself or come with fanfare. It shows up when you realize you haven't thought about pain for days, or when a song plays, and it no longer stings. That's how I felt walking home that evening. The weight I once carried had dissolved so quietly that I almost didn't notice. I looked up at the sky, saw the first stars appear, and whispered a quiet thank you to the world. Survival wasn't the end goal anymore. Living fully was, and I was doing it. As the months passed, I learned to enjoy solitude without feeling lonely. My life became simple. Early mornings at the bakery, evenings with family, and quiet Sundays in the garden. I didn't crave excitement anymore. Peace felt better. I sometimes wondered what Charles was doing, but only in passing, like thinking about an old neighbor. He had become part of a story that ended long ago. My life was now chapters ahead, filled with new beginnings. Time had done what forgiveness couldn't. It erased the sting and left only perspective behind. The bakery celebrated its 1-year anniversary in winter. The shop was full of laughter, music, and warm smells of butter and sugar. Customers brought flowers, and Julian gave a small speech about how proud he was. I stood behind the counter, overwhelmed by how far I had come. A year ago, I was broken, humiliated, and unsure of what came next. Now I was surrounded by light, laughter, and love. The same world that once watched my downfall was now witnessing my rise. This time, it was on my terms. After everyone left that night, I sat alone in the bakery, lights dimmed, just me and the hum of the ovens. I thought about all the versions of myself that had lived through the years. The young bride full of hope, the tired mother trying to hold everything together, the woman betrayed, and the one reborn. Each version of me had done her best with what she knew. I forgave them all. I no longer needed to be angry at the past. Every struggle had led me here, to this quiet moment of peace. Julian dropped by the next morning with breakfast. He said his father had called him recently, asking about me. I told him that was fine. Time changes people. If Charles wanted forgiveness, he didn't need mine. He only needed to forgive himself. Julian nodded, saying he'd told his father that I was doing well. That was enough. I didn't want apologies or explanations. I had already moved past all that. Sometimes the greatest victory is letting go so fully that you don't even feel the need to look back. In the months that followed, I focused on expanding the bakery. I hired 2 young women who reminded me of myself when I was starting out, eager, kind, and full of dreams. Watching them learn brought me joy. I wanted them to know that strength doesn't come from never falling. It comes from standing up again every single time. They listened, smiled, and worked hard. Together, we turned the bakery into something beautiful, a place where second chances were baked into every recipe. It became more than work. It became purpose. One day, as I was teaching one of the new girls how to decorate a cake, a familiar figure walked past the window. It was Charles again, though this time he didn't look broken. He looked peaceful. He paused for a moment, met my eyes through the glass, and gave a small, polite nod. I returned it with the same calmness. No bitterness, no emotion, just quiet acknowledgement. 2 lives that once collided now simply coexisted. That brief glance was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. We were both free. That night, I wrote in my notebook for the first time in months. I wrote about closure. Not as an ending, but as a quiet understanding that pain doesn't need to vanish to stop controlling you. It just needs to be accepted. I realized that healing isn't about erasing what happened. It's about deciding it no longer defines you. I had been betrayed in front of the world, but I had risen with grace. The woman who walked out of that wedding dinner had turned her heartbreak into a home filled with light. The seasons continued to change, and with them, so did I. I started gardening again, something I hadn't done since before the affair. Watching things grow from soil reminded me that beauty often comes from the dirt. I planted roses, the same kind I once kept in front of our old house. When they finally bloomed, their color was deeper, richer than I remembered. Maybe because this time, they were mine alone. Each petal felt like a quiet reward from the universe for choosing peace over bitterness. It felt like renewal. Sometimes I sat outside with coffee, watching customers come and go. People greeted me warmly, some calling me Miss Denise. Others, I loved that. It reminded me that family doesn't always mean blood. It can also be built through kindness. The bakery had become a small heartbeat in our town. I no longer thought about loss when I looked around. I only saw love in the faces that filled the shop, in the laughter that echoed off the walls. What once began as pain had turned into a legacy of compassion. Julian and Sophia often brought their daughter to visit. She had started walking now, wobbling through the aisles with a laugh that filled the whole room. Sometimes she'd reach for a cookie and hand it to me proudly, as if gifting me treasure. I'd take it, smiling, knowing she was growing up surrounded by love and safety, the kind of home I always wanted for my children. Watching her reminded me that broken families can still build better generations. She would never know the pain I carried. She'd only know the peace that followed. Years from now, I know people might forget the details of what happened. The scandal will fade, the gossip will die, and my name will just be another in the town's stories. But the bakery will stay. It will outlive the rumors, carrying forward the quiet message that strength isn't loud, it's patient. Every loaf of bread, every cake, every smile exchanged will tell that story in its own way. I don't need credit for surviving. The life I built is proof enough that I did. That's all the legacy I need. On the anniversary of Julian's wedding, he invited the whole family for dinner. This time, there were no announcements, no tension, just laughter. As I sat at the table surrounded by people I loved, I thought about how full circle life can be. The same kind of evening that once broke me, now healed me. I realized that endings don't always arrive with pain. Sometimes they come disguised as beginnings. I looked around the room, smiling quietly to myself. I had lost a husband, yes, but I had found myself. That was the real victory. That night, back home, I turned off the bakery lights and stood by the window, watching the street glow under the moonlight. The air was calm, the town quiet. I whispered a soft thank you for the lessons, for the strength, for every part of the journey that led me here. The woman who once walked away from her husband's betrayal now stood surrounded by peace, love, and purpose. I didn't need anything else. My story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about renewal, courage, and freedom. And that was a beautiful way to end.